get going with some questions for. So we've got Duncan, research and future. We've got Geoff, commercial and industry. We've got Chad and Mark, hobby, racing, anything, you name it. Hands up if you've got a question. I'll go to you first because you're closer.
Thanks. This is one for Duncan. Duncan, we just had the discussion about Australia exploiting its technology advantage. Where do you position us, I suppose, in a broad ranking on both research and then to the hobbyist, where would you position us, I suppose, from a country perspective?
So I'll speak for research and let the hobby, well, world champion here, so I think that almost answers that part of the question.
For a very brief response, because we've only got about 20 minutes. So
20 minutes, okay, I'll start now. Yeah, okay. Each, right? Our research centre, we collaborate with a lot of the big aerospace companies, so the Boeings of the world, and Thaleses and so forth. I think for the very reasons Geoff talked about, and we do say our regulations are a little old, but they were there early. So Australia's been well ahead of the game, and sure, we need to revise, but it has been able to give us that boot, that quick start, if you like, in research and in innovation. So going back to the UAV challenge, that in itself has been a good platform for innovation. And just to subtly correct Geoff before, the one prize, first prize place was $50,000. So the prize, but there are other awards, but, so you want to win to get the 50K.
I did want to win.
Yeah, sorry, mate. The brown paper bag didn't make it to me. So even with the UAV challenge, in making the safety case to the regulator, there are a number of innovations that came out of that. So geofencing, for instance. There's a lot of open source activity going on around the world, and a lot of it's being inspired actually by UAV challenge. So the notion of geofencing being put into autopilots, which are now open source. So you can fly along and set up geo boundaries and make sure the machine doesn't fly out of that. And that was a rule that we brought in for UAV challenge, and that's now out there. I think Bernie was talking about size, weight, power. There you are. Size, weight and power before. So the fact that we do have to fit an awful lot of technology into these little tackers here, where the size must be small, the weight must be small, and the power must be virtually nothing. So how do you get what could be a big box that sits on a commercial airliner into something that big? So little RF communication modems, for instance. There's the local company actually is producing those, and that's come out of UAV Challenge.
Great.
So I think it's just us being ahead of the pack, but our challenge is we've got to stay ahead of the pack.
Exactly. Chad, have you got, or Mark, anything more to say apart from us actually being number one?
Mini quads actually were pretty much born in Brisbane, mid-2013, so we can pretty much argue that this is where it started.
All right. That's good. We'll keep going with the questions.
This is for Duncan and Geoff. What kind of improvements can be made in the future for the UAV or UAS system?
So we probably got two angles on that, so I'll pass it to Geoff. So one of the things, or two of the things we can't do right now, that the way, and I think Chad was saying, so at the moment the regs are pretty tight, and essentially for the commercial point of view, actually I think it was Mark saying this, is you've got to stay within visual line of sight of the aircraft. So that means I've got to be able to see it. It's not too far. We can also only have one machine in that same little bit of airspace by itself. Someone was saying earlier, I think Geoff was saying, that you started doing a people count to run a single machine. It's a very manned, unmanned system, whereas the technology really could let us invert the whole thing. So from a technical point of view, there's no reason why it couldn't be a single person and have multiple machines out there. So this is where the research push is right now. How can we demonstrate to the regulator that we can put multiple machines in the air at the same time, do the safety case for that, and having a single mission commander, so to speak? That could be the farmer. Send a whole bunch of them out in the paddock, tell me what you're doing. The other one is beyond visual line of sight. So again, the technology, it exists now. There's no reason why we can't fly the aircraft from a technical point of view beyond visual line of sight of the human. But again, we've got to demonstrate the safety case, demonstrate the safety and the technology, and have the regulator accept that case. Geoff just mentioned something. I'll actually let Geoff talk about it.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. So... Sorry, I can't...
No, they're just having a chat. So. Okay, very good.
One of the issues from the regulator is because it's called sense and avoid, and effectively an unmanned system, you're not sitting in there. So theoretically, if aircraft are flying towards each other, theoretically we're going to think the pilots are going to take steps to avoid a collision. If you don't have a person sitting in that aircraft, how do you do that? So there are technologies that are being developed, and ARC is one of the groups that are working on that to get around that problem. So that's one of the big problems for larger UAV systems. It's not so much an issue for the smaller ones, because obviously if that was to hit an aircraft, there would be very little, and it's comparable to what aircraft are designed for in bird strikes. As far as stopping business and us progressing in the future, it's all about managing risk from a business perspective. So the regulator, because it's so conservative at the moment with things being new, as they start to feel that the manned system technologies, and we, as Duncan mentioned, we have a number of people crewing a single UAV. The system could, that one person could crew several UAVs, not two people to one. So as the technology improves and the safety is shown to be effective, and one of these things is going to be time and also I suppose risk methodology, and the new technologies that come on board will help with that.
Great.
And that's really where we're going.
Okay, let's we've got a question for our hobbyists.
G'day. Having been in the remote control aeroplanes and helicopters and stuff for the last 8 years or more, seeing all this stuff evolve is incredible. But coming from someone who flies RC helicopters and all that sort of stuff, how do you get into the drone stuff? Because you're saying it's quite popular here, and I've never heard anything about it. So yeah, how do you get into that, and how is it coming from a helicopter, the controls and all that kind of gear and whatnot?
Well, it's very, very similar. If you could fly a helicopter, you could fly one of these things pretty much overnight. The controls are very much identical. The way that it responds is very different. As far as knowing about it, it is still largely an underground community. It's basically been forced to be an underground community because a lot of the regulators and councils didn't want us around. A lot of the model aircraft clubs don't want to know you, so you're sort of like an outsider, so you go and do your own thing in empty car parks or parks and lots of stuff and do your own thing. But as everything's progressed and people have seen that what we're doing is not dangerous, it's becoming accepted. For example, things like the MAAQ, the MAAA, the Aeronautical Body of Australia is actually starting to put out practical rules that we can actually follow, so it means that we can actually go to these clubs. So thank you, MAAA. And CASA is starting to realise that we're not actually abducting children, and fairies aren't dying every single time we take off.
But thanks for bringing up that issue of child abduction, Chad. That's great. All right. Now, we've only probably got time for another 2 or 3 questions. So we've got one here, and we won't get to everyone's, but are you guys happy to stick around for a few minutes afterwards and take people's questions? So if you don't get heard now, don't worry. We've only got time for another couple now.
My question is for Duncan. With drones becoming quite popular with hobbyists and industry, I've seen quads that have several rotors on them and they're quite large. How possible is it that they'll get bigger and bigger to do more complex and heavy-duty tasks? And is there any way to stop them getting too big, and where do they become actual aircraft besides just small drones?
Give that person a prize. That's a great question.
I'm sorry, I already gave her the prize, but yeah, that is an excellent question. I wish I'd bloody well thought of it.
That's right.
Yeah, Jeff.
Duncan. No.
Sorry, Duncan.
Do I get a prize for that? So last question first. The regulator views all of these things as aircraft, even those things they're aircraft. I have seen prototypes in the US where we've got these multi-rotors big enough to lift people and so forth. The real limitation is actually to do with the power. So these things here, what do you get, about 15 minutes out of it, 20 minutes?
If that.
Yeah.
You'd be lucky.
Yeah, so it's really the battery technology is the limiting factor right now. So it's going to be a long time before we see those sorts of machines on large missions where, fly away for hours and so forth. There's a lot of work going on in battery technology right now, actually including here at QUT.
Battery technology is the weak link right now.
Yeah, I mean, even doubling the capacity of what that's got, that's a game changer in itself.
I've had an interest in these UAVs for quite a while, and I've got a friend who he works on algorithms that look at different kinds of vegetation. So these UAVs fly over like the Amazon and other areas in Africa, and they can see sort of the production levels based on the color of the plant life and stuff. And I thought that was quite interesting that they could do that. I was wondering how commercialized that technology is. I've heard that it's very expensive to write those algorithms and they're sort of very proprietary. So I was wondering if open source stuff is being developed. That was the first thing.
I reckon that's a great question to start with.
Yeah.
So last bit first. So when I talk about agriculture, that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. And we could also use the term plant biosecurity, so where we've got plants we don't want. In fact, we did some work on this last year. So those algorithms that you talk about, they can be simple, they can be very, very complex. We're doing some work here at QUT and other places around the country where it's not just a vision type camera like those, but multispectral, hyperspectral. So looking at spectral components that we can't even see. And using that, we can tell what's the vigour of the plant. Is it water stressed? Is it one we want, one we don't want? So there's... is there open source? Yes, some of the development packages, there is an open source community that you can actually get routines to do this sort of work. Where we're really pushing the envelope in the research is looking at those hyperspectral, those extra spectral characteristics. And the idea is to get it on board a platform, and that's actually a bit of a challenge. Did I answer all of that?
Yep, you answered part A, and we've only got time for part A, but we've got a quad flyer here who has a question. What's your name and what's your question?
Fallon Chan. I'd like to ask, if you were to fly a drone to, like, a bushfire, why can't you use, like, aeroplanes to get there faster with the firefighters?
Why are you sending drones when you can take actual firefighters with an aeroplane?
Would you rather risk a drone or a human life?
I think that's a very good answer. That's what I was going to say. And that's really what they're doing. One of the situations that came up with some of the fires down in Victoria was because of the heat, the smoke and the conditions, it wasn't possible to get people in there, risk other people by having manned aircraft in there. So if you can put a drone in there and it crashes, nobody dies. And that's really the main reason. I think, Duncan, you had some others?
Yep. That is a really great question. You've got a shirt, good. So the other part to this is when you've got a bushfire at night, the manned assets are actually down. So the manned planes, helicopters, they don't fly at night. It's too dangerous. So they lose what they call situational awareness overnight. So no one's quite sure what the fire is doing, where it's going. If it changes direction, do they know when it actually happens? So the proposal there is that if we can fly drones, there you go, I said it, fly drones at night, then we can actually see and measure the heat coming from the fire. And that way we could actually know, the fire's changed, this population's in trouble. So it's night time's another opportunity.
We're just going to squeeze in another, even though that was such an excellent question, we're going to squeeze in another one or two. So your question for Jeff? Or
my question is, given so many possibilities of the industry used by drone, at the moment, is there any framework or standards, the framework or operating system or API used by anyone could develop apps for specific area?
Okay, so you're talking about software development capability. So there are a number of groups around the world that do this sort of work. There's a place in Zurich in Switzerland called ETH, and they develop a lot of open source autopilots and the software that go on those autopilots. And that's what I was talking about with the Outback Challenge. Some of that software's ended up on those autopilots. One of the, so if you look at places like that around the world, there are some open source. It's not going to be a highly developed API, I think you mentioned, but at least it's they're Linux-based systems, so technical. I'll get away from the technical now.
I just got a question regarding startups. Could you guys mention something about social acceptance, and if we were to develop a new application for the unmanned aerial vehicle, what's the first step that you would recommend to see if the society would accept the idea?
Education really is the key to this, and really there's, I guess it's an evolutionary thing with all of us that we always fear the unknown, and it doesn't matter what it is, and in this case a lot of people don't understand the technology so that they fear it, and really understanding is going to come through education. So that's, for me, the regulator and all of us, the more we learn about it, the more we can educate people about it. So if you're trying to get in as a startup, I'd firstly find out and educate your prospective customers as to what the benefits are, and make sure that they understand that you are looking at this commercially and safely, because no organisation wants to be on the front page of the Courier Mail with a crashed fire caused by a drone. That's certainly the last thing they want. So they want to make sure that you've looked at this, you're going to do it properly, safely, and it's not going to affect them from a reputation point of view as well.
Great, thanks so much, Jeff. And we've got time for one last question for our hobbyist, and here it is here.
I rocked up late, so I'm not sure if you've already discussed this.
I don't think you're allowed a question.
It's regarding privacy, and you might have drones going around doing whatever they do, racing or whatever, but to someone who's just in their house and they see a drone coming up beside it, I see a few issues around that regarding, concerns about privacy. How do you deal with that, and what way does a person have to, defend themselves against potentially someone who's just gone and bought a drone with a camera?
Yep. And this does come up a reasonable amount. We meet a lot of people in the park and talk to them. And one of the first things some people do say is, oh, you could go and spy on people with that. Strangely enough, that's never actually occurred to us because we're too busy having fun just flying around the park. But regarding privacy, it's illegal to stick a camera on a pole and stick it over your neighbour's fence or point it in their window. Exactly the same things apply. And if you remember when these things first came in, all phones are going to have cameras. It's going to be the end of privacy for everyone, and there was a big thing for a while with that, but it's just blown over. Now people accept it, there's just cameras and things everywhere. It's no more legal to fly this and look in your window than it is, to do anything else. So the same laws apply. None of the people that we know are even vaguely interested in looking at anyone's windows. And the quality of the video, I don't know if you managed to have a look through the goggles before, but you can see the resolution is actually quite low. So
good enough for new idea though. But, yeah.
Worth pointing out too that pretty much every camera we use has a fisheye lens on it, so we're having trouble at altitude working out which house is yours, let alone what you're putting on your washing line out the back. So.
Great.
Reality of life is your life is boring, and if
and that's
I hate
from
to tell you,
who flies drones on the weekend.
We'd be using this if we were worried about invading your privacy. So, yeah.
Excellent.
We can use those, and they don't make any noise at all. These things are not subtle.
Before we go any further, I'll just announce these gorgeous T-shirts that have got the very groovy designs with the headsets on them. They're FPV Rebels. Here, read it, because clearly I can't read out. FPV Rebels, who have brought together our panel today. So they're kind of like our sponsors. So thank you.
And they even got me a black one.
They've even got a black one for the hardcore quad, operators. Join me in thanking our panel, Duncan, Jeff, Chad, and Mark. Thank you guys for all your great questions. Like I said, if you've got questions that haven't been answered yet, these guys are sticking around for a bit. If they're not here, they'll be just out there. And great to have you along here today.